Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Leadership in Action, Administrators and the IEP Process. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the best practices in IEP development, including staffing the IEP meeting, notice the requirements that we have under IDEA and the IEP amendments to implementing and monitoring. And then also we're going to emphasize the importance of leadership in achieving these positive educational outcomes that we're looking for students with disabilities. I'm Lorie Gerkey, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. So grab your coffee and maybe a snack, and we're off and running. So here's our agenda today. We're going to start with introductions. And then we're going to, after introductions, then we're going to talk a little bit about the legal background, the foundation of IDEA. We're going to kind of go into that a little bit, just as a reminder, getting us all on the same page. And then we're going to talk a little bit about understanding that whole IEP process and what our role is as a leader in our school or a leader in our district. And then finally, we're going to end with information about how you can be a chief advocate for students with disabilities in your schools or in your district. So I'd like you to take a minute for introductions and just enter this information in the chat. Your name, your position, your district, and maybe how long you've been working in the schools. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the position you're currently in, but just in general, how long you've been working in schools. And while you're doing that, let me kind of tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Lorie Gerkey, and I am a school law attorney with expertise in special education. Prior to becoming an attorney, I spent 30 years in public education as a special education teacher and a special education administrator. I've been practicing now law. This is my second career. I've been practicing special education law for about 6.5 years. And this experience I have with experience in the public schools and now as an attorney, I really try very hard to support school leaders in becoming legally literate in IDEA and the processes that are going to keep you in compliance. And so I kind of call this my preventative practice. And hopefully you'll gain some insight into the legal requirements that we have in order to stay compliant and provide services to students with disabilities. I try really hard to provide this practical and legal advice to assist you in your day-to-day job. So enough about me. Let's see who we have. Selena, can you tell us maybe a little bit about who we have in the audience?
Yeah, we have educator for 8 years, CTE program coordinator,
Nice.
principal, first grade teacher,
Awesome.
and we have special ed.
Okay.
And I'll read off a few more and then I'll hand it back to you. Assistant principal and dean of students.
Awesome. Very good. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. You have some good expertise in the classroom in a variety of different areas. Today, of course, like I said, we're going to really focus in on the administrator's role in special education and that whole IEP process. So here, as an administrator, a leader in your school or in your district, you really have to understand our duty for FAPE, our free, appropriate public education. And we want to make sure that you're ensuring your staff make data-based decisions and monitor and share progress with families and each other, actually, right? We want to make sure that you're leading your staff to communicate effectively with parents. And of course, the most important aspect of being an administrator in a school is to make sure that your staff is implementing the IEP, that Individual Education Program. You have this important supervisory role. So I want to make sure that you know what's required for your staff and how you can support them in this whole idea of provision of FAPE, that free, appropriate public education. We're also going to talk a little bit about LRE, least restrictive environment, understanding the IEP process, understanding your role in the IEP meeting itself, and then understanding how you're going to be a chief advocate. So we're going to start with this understanding of FAPE. So when we talk about how FAPE is determined and what is FAPE, that free appropriate public education, we really do need to start from the beginning. In 1982, we had our first U.S. Supreme Court case that was regarding the provision of FAPE, and this was the Rowley case. And this decision actually created two standards of procedure, as it were, for FAPE. And we have a procedural standard. Did we follow all of the procedures set out in IDEA for the formulation of that IEP, including like the notice requirements and prior written notice and all the IEP team members at the table? And then we have this second prong, which is this substantive standard. And that really falls to the quality of the IEP. Is it reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefit? Now, that was our standard in 1983 when the Rowley case actually went to the Supreme Court and they made their decision. We've lived with those standards up until 2017. And then in 2017, which I think was about 35 years later, we had our second U.S. Supreme Court case on FAPE, on free appropriate public education, and that was the Andrew F. case. And this case really didn't alter those two-pronged standards, but instead it really refined the second standard, that substantive standard. And now our substantive standard asks us to say, is that IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances? So this changed slightly, but it was very important. Courts are no longer going to look for just this de minimis standard that used to be under the Rowley standard. De minimis was something that is the child making just minimal progress. As long as they're making the slightest progress, we're going to say they met the FAPE standard. Under Andrew F., they took that kind of de minimis out and said that is the IEP reasonably calculated to enable that child to make progress that's appropriate in light of their individualized, unique circumstances. So we know that nothing in the IEP should be standardized, whether it's services, whether it's goals, whether it's present levels. It all really does need to be based on the individual student needs. And that's what's going to make that IEP reasonable, so long as we're looking at the individual needs of the student. And then when we've missed either those procedural violations, either one of those, the courts then look at three things to determine if there was a denial of FAPE. And so they look at, did the violation impede the child's right to FAPE, to that free appropriate public education? Did the violation significantly impede the parent's right to participate in all of those decision-making aspects of the IEP? Or did the violation cause a deprivation of educational benefit? So when we're looking at those two standards, the procedural standard and the substantive standard, the courts actually have to say, okay, we had a violation in one of those two, or even both of those, but they look at these three questions to determine whether there was a denial of FAPE. And so how is that reasonably calculated portion of our standard to provide educational benefit? How is that determined? And this case is out of the 8th Circuit. Now, just to remind you, we're in the 10th Circuit. And what that means is the 8th Circuit cases are not binding on our circuit, on our state, on the way we process things, but they are very, very persuasive. So if there is not a case in the 10th Circuit that talks to this reasonably calculated idea, then we would look to any other circuit to help us define what that looks like. And how we get to the circuit court is if a parent files a special education due process hearing in our state against our district, we would go to that hearing. If and that's put on, the hearing officer is provided through an MPED. So then if one of the parties aren't in agreement with the decision, right? Then they have a right to appeal, and they would appeal to a district court. And if then somebody doesn't really like that opinion, they could appeal to the circuit court. And so the circuit court is a larger group of states that that they handle like multiple states when they're doing that appeal. And then of course, if either party doesn't like what the circuit court says, then it would go to the Supreme Court. So in this case, this is out of the 8th Circuit. Again, not binding because we're in the 10th, but it is persuasive. And so this circuit court found that the district did not deny FAPE, even when they did not provide all of those services in the IEP. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't implement the IEP as it's written, but if there happens to be some implementation failures and the student is still making progress, then the occasional lapse of those services will not result in a denial of FAPE. So remember, the courts look at those 3 things. Did the violation impede the child's right to FAPE? Did it significantly impede the parent's right to participate? Or did the violation cause a deprivation of educational benefit? And if the child is still making progress, there's no deprivation of educational progress or benefit. And then in this case, the court actually said that the school need not maximize the student's potential to provide the best possible education at public expense. It just has to be reasonably calculated. And this also was out of the, actually, this is the same case. It's out of the 8th Circuit. Now, this case, we have 2 cases here, one at the top and one at the bottom. And the Waller case, the one that's down there at the bottom, that's the case that we really looked at. And this was out of the 5th Circuit, not the 10th. And in this case, the bottom one, the Waller case, they found that Andrew F., that U.S. Supreme Court case that we had, did not invalidate the 4-factor test that was set out in the Cypress Fairbanks case. That was also out of the 5th Circuit. And out of this Cypress Fairbanks case in 1997, they determined that these are the 4 parts that a school can determine if in fact the IEP is reasonably calculated. And so they said the program is individualized and based on the student's assessments and performance. So long as our IEP is developed based on accurate and comprehensive data, then and it's individualized to the student, then we're okay. The program is administered in the least restrictive environment. Again, is it individualized and meeting the standard of the law, least restrictive environment? Are the services provided in a coordinated and collaborative manner by the key stakeholders? Are we all working together to make sure that we are implementing the IEP as it's written? And then also positive academic and non-academic benefits are demonstrated. So again, those out of the 5th Circuit, again, we're in the 10th, but out of the 5th Circuit, they've kind of outlined these 4 ways to consider if the IEP is reasonably calculated. And the Waller case that is most recent, was 2017, they said that our Andrew F. standard did not change the way we look at is it reasonably calculated. And so now, as an administrator and a leader in your school, you really do need to understand what LRE is, that least restrictive environment, and how you can make sure and ensure that your staff understand this as well. So LRE, this is another foundational portion of IDEA, and districts and school leaders really must ensure that students with disabilities are educated alongside their peers without disabilities, to the maximum extent appropriate. And I really call your attention to that because many times people will say, well, every student with a disability has to be educated in the general classroom. We're a full inclusion school, everybody gets it. But that's not really what the LRE provision says. The LRE provision really does say to the maximum extent appropriate for that child. And so these placement decisions can only be made by an IEP team, and they cannot be based on cost or educational convenience or administrative convenience. The IEP team makes that LRE decision. So when I hear as an attorney, I hear we're a full inclusion school. What I get the sense is, and I have to remind folks, that if the student requires a more restrictive environment than the general education setting, then we need to provide that. We can't just say, oh, everybody's included, that's the way it is, because then again, it's not individualized. And the whole part of IDEA and the IEP is that individualized education program. This provision, if you look at that second bullet, does allow for students to be removed from the general education environment, but only if the student's needs are such that even with giving them supplementary aids and services, the student cannot satisfactorily achieve education in the regular environment. So it does give us that lens to be able to look at the child and all the data that we have on the child and say, what is going to be the least restrictive environment for this student? It may be in the general education classroom, but if in fact their disability is such that even with all of the supplementary aids and services that we provide, it's not going to provide them enough service to satisfactorily achieve an appropriate education. And along with the LRE provision in the regular classroom, we also must ensure that students with disabilities are included with their peers without disabilities in extracurricular activities as well as non-academic services. So we can't forget that piece, that we want to look at where in their school day can they interact and be with students without disabilities, whether that be in academic, non-academic, or extracurricular activities. As an administrator, you're really going to want to make sure you understand that whole IEP process, both the procedural process as well as the substantive process. So we're going to talk about both of those processes now. So as a reminder, decisions in special education come from the bottom and they work their way up to the top. The evaluation data is the starting point for every decision that we make for every student. And so the IEP team makes all of the decisions based on the evaluation data. And from there, that decision goes then to the teachers. That decision then from the teachers goes to the administrator at the building. From the administrator at the building, it goes then to the district office. From district office, it goes to superintendent. From superintendent, it goes to the board. So you can see the farther up the chain of command, the less input they have in decisions for students with disabilities. The IEP team is a powerful, powerful team, right? And the district is bound by the decisions that the IEP team makes. One person cannot make a decision for a student with an IEP. It's always a team, right? We have to make sure that we're creative when we're developing that IEP. And when we think about mitigating any kind of legal liability, we have to make sure that your teams know this. They have to know when to convene an IEP meeting. You and your team need to know who the required members are. You need to know, can we have a meeting without one of those required one of those required members? Who's going to act as our agency representative? And what are those qualifications that we have? We have to know how those decisions are going to be made and how to respond to any of those requests that come in from parents. And we also have to give parents an opportunity for meaningful participation. These are the procedural requirements that we really we as a leader have to know, as well as our teachers need to know. So when do we convene, right? Well, IDEA tells us that at least once per year we have to address whether the annual goals are being achieved, any lack of expected progress, results of a reevaluation, information provided by the parent, and the child's anticipated needs, or any other matters. So we know that there are many times throughout the year that we have to convene an IEP meeting. So don't just limit yourself to what this once a year to address all these pieces, right? We know we have manifestation meetings. We know we have meetings to address behavior. We know we have amendment meetings. We know we have meetings to address progress, changing of goals. If a student has made progress on goals, we want to amend those goals. Or if they haven't made progress in goals, we want to meet to say why. Why not? Why haven't we made progress? So there's lots of other times that we have meetings. We'd love to say once a year, all we have is an IEP meeting, but we know that's not true. So keeping that open mind, and you as a leader knowing when we have to have a meeting, when we should have a meeting. And then once we figure out when to convene that meeting, we know we have a procedural requirement to provide notice. We must provide notice to the parents when that IEP meeting is, to ensure that they have an opportunity to attend the meeting, because it has to be scheduled at a mutually agreeable time and place. Many times what will happen is we as the school team or the IEP team will just send a meeting notice home saying, yep, calendar, we've got open on Thursday. So Thursday at 2:00, here's your invitation. That's when we're having the meeting. Parent says, gosh, I'm working. I can't really make that meeting, but I really want to attend. So that's not how we want to schedule those meetings. It's not the convenience of us. We have to have this opportunity to attend. The parents have to have an opportunity to attend the meeting, and it has to be scheduled in a mutually agreeable place and time. So giving that parent 3 or 4 options to say, here's when we're available to have Lorie's IEP meeting. We'd love for you to be part of it. Will you please let us know if any of these dates and times work for you, right? Now, we do know that there are times that we can have an IEP meeting without the parent, and that only is when the parent affirmatively tells us they will not come. If they tell us, I can't meet that time, but I'd really like to meet over here, or I really would like to meet, but I can't meet any of those 4 that you've given me. Is there another time that we can do this? That's not affirmatively telling us that we can't, that they don't want to meet. Okay. So it's a matter of encouraging the parent to participate. Maybe we participate virtually as opposed to in person or telephonically, but we always want the parents to be involved. And further, when we provide that notice, that meeting notice, we know it has to be in writing. We have to indicate who is going to be in attendance, the purpose of that meeting, the time and location of that meeting. And the meeting notice also must tell them you can invite anybody to the meeting you'd like. Just kind of let us know, right? We want to make sure that you're inviting people that are knowledgeable and have maybe special expertise about the child. Um, this is kind of a key phrase when we know parents want to invite maybe an advocate or maybe an attorney to the IEP meeting. I always question whether that attorney or that advocate really do have the knowledge or the expertise about the child. But typically, we never say no when a parent wants to bring an advocate or an attorney. If they bring an attorney, you probably want to have your own attorney at the table. Okay. Um, so here are some cases to consider when we talk about notice. So here, this due process hearing in Tennessee, this is a recent case. The Tennessee Department of Education found that the district failed to provide parent of a student with a disability a written notice within 10 school days of the IEP meeting, which was a violation in their mind of IDEA and the Tennessee Board of Education rule. So we have to be cognizant of our rules in our state. In Tennessee, they have a firm, you must invite the parent 10 days prior to holding the meeting. There's nothing in IDEA that says 10 days, but there, in this particular case in Tennessee, their board rule said you will give them 10 days notice. This other case here out of Ohio, again, it was a due process, and the district violated IDEA when it had the superintendent attend the IEP meeting without providing notice or informing the parent that the superintendent was going to attend. We also had a violation because during that meeting, the parent felt disrespected when the superintendent stated, okay, this is how it's all going to go down. And so you have to be really careful what we say. Words really matter. We're going to talk about that a little later. But part of the invitation, part of that notice to the parents for a meeting indicates who's going to be at the table. And so in this particular case, the parent felt like they were disrespected because they didn't, one, by what he said, and two, that they didn't know the superintendent was going to be there. So again, it's all about just that notice. Now, we don't have to identify the attendees by name, but certainly as long as it as long as it informs the parent by position, we're okay. And we have that guidance from the Office of Special Education Programs, which is a sub-arm of U.S. Department of Ed who provides guidance to the field on implementing IDEA. And another part that you really do need to know is who are the essential members at the IEP team. This, as a leader, you want to make sure that you have that full complement of required members at the table in order to have a duly constituted IEP team meeting. And so you need the parent. You need a general education teacher of the child. And I pause with that a little bit because many people just say, oh, we need a gen ed teacher. No, you need a gen ed teacher of the child. If the child is not in general education, you also need a general education teacher who could potentially be that child's teacher, meaning it's a grade level teacher. Okay, so the reason you want that general education teacher there is because they're going to inform the IEP team about what's required in the general curriculum. So if the student is not in general curriculum or general classroom right now, and we have that third grade teacher there who the child's in third grade teacher in there, they can then tell the IEP team, look at this is what a typical third grade learner is learning. This is a typical third grade behavior that we see. This is what we expect of our typical third grade learners. This informs the IEP team so that then we can design the IEP to build some skills for Lorie so that she can be successful in the general education setting once she gets there. So if she's not displaying the academic skill that you need in a typical learner in third grade, then that will be part of our plan for Lorie to build her skills so that she can participate academically or behaviorally or socially in the third grade class appropriately. You also need a special education teacher of the child, again, of the child, not just any special ed teacher. You also need a school district representative, and we're going to talk about their role in a minute. And most of the time, that's an administrator, but every school is different. You can the district and the school has an opportunity to identify who their district representative is, as long as they meet the qualifications. You're good to go. And then you also need a person who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluations. That is, any one of these members could do that. You could have a school psychologist if you're looking at evaluation. If you're looking at classroom data and progress on goals, your special education teacher can certainly interpret those instructional implications of that evaluation, correct? So don't always think of that as having to be a school psychologist or a diag or something to that effect. Now, we have two other positions that are listed as essential members. The student, if it's appropriate, and then also discretionary members. Anybody that the parent wants to bring or anybody that the school district wants to bring. And usually our discretionary members under IDEA state that it's a related service provider. Now, if your procedures in your school district say we want all related service providers at the table, then please do so. But IDEA calls them discretionary members, so they don't necessarily have to be at every IEP meeting.
And
But if your
Lorie,
procedures say that, yes,
you do have a question in the chat.
sure.
It says, are there any recommendations for parents who are divorced? Do both parents need to be notified and invited?
That's a great question. And you're going to need to do a little research. So you're going to want to take a look to see if there is a custody agreement. And in that family plan custody agreement, is there someone identified as having educational decision making? If both parties have educational decision making, then our obligation is to notify both. Do both need to attend? No, we only need one to attend, but we want to invite both. If both can attend and they're going to be cordial, then that's awesome. If it's going to bring some contention, we only need one. And we wouldn't make that decision. They would. Our responsibility would be to notify both, especially if educational decision making has not been noted in their divorce decree or their family planning or whatever. I know there's a specific terminology for that document, the custody agreement that they have. So you'll want to invite both, and if both can come, hooray! And if not, then one is all we need. The other question that I get a lot of is, well, what if one parent wants evaluation and will sign consent and the other one doesn't? And so now what do we do? So again, all we need is one parent signature. And so long as both parents, or at least that signature, has still educational decision-making rights, then we would go with the evaluation. And then the parent that didn't like that we were doing an evaluation, then they have the procedural safeguards to then say, I'm going to file a due process against the school district because I disagree. I don't want my child evaluated. We normally see this in evaluation. Many times we'll see it in the provision of services. And so one parent says, yes, I want Lorie to receive those services. And the other parent says, I don't want Lorie to receive those services. No. And so we typically will accept the consent from the consenting parent, and then provide procedural safeguards to the parent who disagrees. So it's really important to know who are the members of the IEP team. And do we have this duly constituted IEP? So obviously we want to include the parent. It's extremely important. These couple cases, these are most recent. This is in 2024. And this was in, I think that's supposed to, oh, that's the Central District of California, excuse me. This was the district court level. So we had a hearing officer made a decision. Somebody didn't like it and went to the district court. And this district court, and so this decision is only binding in California in that district's court area. So the Central District of California, that's only binding, but they're always very instructive. So that's why attorneys use cases. So this case, actually, they found that the district violated FAPE because they held an annual IEP review meeting for this sixth grade student without the parent there. And and this I think was key, they rejected the parents' proposed dates for the IEP and continuing to suggest its own dates were based on staff availability. And that was all we needed to worry about. We didn't have to worry about parents' availability. And they just said, the court said that the hearing officer's decision and then the district court's decision sided with the hearing officer, came down to one key fact, that despite the district's many attempts to contact the parent and set an amenable time and date for the IEP team meeting, the parent's consistent lack of response, at no time did the parent affirmatively refuse to attend the IEP meeting. So if we can get the parents to say, I'm unwilling to participate, we want to make sure that we're offering other alternatives, right? Whether it's video conferencing, whether it's telephone conference, we want to try to get them involved, right? And we have under IDEA in this 300.323, we have this part of the regulation that tells us that we can do video conferencing like Zoom or individual telephone conferencing, those kinds of things. Make sure that our teachers participate. Now, we do know that we have an availability to excuse our teachers, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but we need to make sure that our teachers are there and they're engaged in the process. At least one regular ed teacher of the child, we've already talked about that, is or may be participating in regular education. They give us that information about the general curriculum, or even from their own class. And then it also gives input from other general education teachers. And here's just a case that the district denied FAPE in not having a general education teacher participate in the IEP team when the teacher was available but did not want to attend the meeting because the advocate's harsh communication tone. So if we have a situation where a teacher is just saying, no, you can't make me come, as a leader in your school or soon to be leader in your school, that's going to be a conversation that you're going to have with that teacher, because that's part of our professional responsibility. And so it's not necessarily an IEP gig, it's really an HR gig, right? It's that evaluation of our teachers. And so if we have a teacher who is outright refusing to participate in this IEP meeting, one, in this particular case, it was because the advocate had such a harsh way to communicate. Then if that's the scenario, then you as the leader are going to need to go into that IEP meeting and you're going to have to settle down that advocate and their inappropriate communication tone. Okay. But we also have to hold our teachers accountable for going and being and participating in those IEP meetings. Make sure that they're present. Like we said, we need at least one special ed teacher of the child or special ed provider of the child. And here again, the district in this case, this was a hearing officer case in Ohio, the district violated IDEA when it had the school assistant center director who held a special ed license but was not serving the child. They participated in that IEP meeting and they denied FAPE because they did not have a special education teacher of the child. So it doesn't matter what license you hold in this particular case. in all particular cases, general education teacher, special education teacher, if you're an administrator and you're going to the meeting and yes, you have your administrative license, but you also have your gen ed license, if you are not the teacher of the child, you cannot sign as a gen ed teacher, right? You can sign maybe as that agency rep, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But you cannot sign as the general education teacher and participate in that meeting as the general education teacher because you're not the general education teacher of the child. Same thing goes as special ed. So if you have a special ed endorsement and now you're the leader of the school, you cannot sit in an IEP and represent the special education teacher of the child unless you actually are. And so we know we have to have an agency rep. That's one of the required members. So what does an agency rep do and what are their qualifications? Well, we have 4 qualifications that we have to have. We have to be qualified to provide or supervise the provision of special education. We have to be knowledgeable about general education. We have to be knowledgeable about the availability of resources. And we have to have the authority to commit those resources. So it's not just good to say, yes, I meet 1, I meet 2, I meet 3, but gosh, I need permission to see if we can do a door-to-door transportation. Or wait, I need to see if we can actually have permission to provide this accommodation or this modification or give Lorie the iPad, right? Then you're not the agency rep. And it means that we don't have a duly constituted IEP team. So making sure that whoever is our agency rep is the person who can commit those resources. Public agency can determine which staff member is going to serve as that agency rep. They just have to meet those 4 criteria. So as a leader of a school, if you say, and I've seen this happen before, we have a school psychologist who is a great, strong leader in our special education division. And so we bless her as the agency rep. Please make sure that you've given her the authority to commit those resources.
Okay, there's another question.
Sure.
Does a general education teacher have to attend the IEP for a speech-only IEP, initial or annual?
Either one, initial or annual. General education teacher of the child for any child that is eligible under IDEA for an IEP. Does not matter about what your eligibility is. It matters that you have an IEP. And if you're having an IEP team meeting, then yes, the general education teacher of the child must be there. We always think that maybe there's a little wiggle room with eligibility, and there isn't. Okay, so making a decision. As an LEA rep, it's your responsibility, or the agency rep, the LEA rep's responsibility, to ensure that the educational program that's being offered is appropriate. And if there are disagreements or the team can't come to consensus, then the LEA makes that final decision for the district. All right, that's the local education agency rep, or the agency rep, or the district rep, however we have a lot of terminology for that position. So it could be the LEA rep, it could be the district rep, it could be the agency rep. But that's your role. Your role is to make sure that the IEP team is offering that reasonable IEP that the child can then make appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. And if there's a disagreement between the parent and the district about consensus on what we're going to provide to Lorie, then that district rep, that LEA rep, that agency rep makes the decision on behalf of the district. Okay. And I want to just remind you, never, ever, ever in any IEP meeting, manifestation meeting, eligibility meeting, there is never a vote. It's never a vote. Think about that. If we take a vote, who's going to be outnumbered? It's always going to be the parent. And we don't want that. It's about building consensus. Is this a decision that we can all live with? That's the question that we have. in this IEP. It's never a vote. So please don't say how many people think, and it's never a vote. Don't do that. Never a vote. Here are a few questions that maybe our agency rep should ask when we're either in the meeting or as we're preparing for that meeting. Making sure that the IEP meets the student's unique needs, right? Ask these questions. Does the student need any additional services? Is the student receiving too many services? Because again, if we don't provide enough or we provide way too much, the child's not receiving that free appropriate public education. What's the goal for the student post-secondary education? Now, many of you, if you're in elementary schools, we tend to not think about post-secondary, middle school and high school, because in New Mexico, we have to look at kids that are turning 14. Their IEP that's going to be in place when the child turns 14 is when we have to start looking at that post-secondary education. So is the goal, what is that goal for that student as they think about leaving high school and the school system? Are parents' concerns and requests, are they reasonably addressed? Did we ask more probing questions of the parent? Why do you want that one-to-one aid? Why do you think Lorie has autism? Let's explore some of their questions and concerns and make sure that we're capturing those in the prior written notice. And then are we in compliance with all of these procedural requirements? Remember, we talked about procedural and substantive. I'm only at the procedural part right now. So we still have a whole boatload of other substantive processes that we want to cover as well. But remember, are we in compliance with those? So you as the agency rep or whoever you are going to appoint as the agency rep really does need to truly understand this whole IEP process, both the procedural as well as the substantive. Now, remember I said, we do have some excusal processes under IDEA that we can. So what happens if a team member that is required can't attend an IEP meeting? Well, we know that the parents and the school district can jointly excuse any IEP member from attending the meeting if the service or curriculum area is not going to be discussed. So let's say we're not doing an annual IEP, but let's say we're just doing a review. Lorie's made some progress in math, and we want to update the math goal. Okay, she has some other services in reading and writing, but math is where we want to look at right now because she's made some really good progress. So can we have an IEP meeting without the reading teacher, without the writing teacher? Can we just do the special education teacher of the child and the math teacher of the child and the parent and maybe the student? Can we do that? And the LEA rep. Can we do that? Well, we can if the parent and the district jointly excuse and agree that the reading teacher and the writing teacher don't need to be there. Okay, so that's one way. So the parents in the other way is, what if we are talking about math, but the math teacher can't be there? Can we excuse the math teacher, or do we have to postpone the meeting, or do we have to reschedule the meeting? Well, if the parent and the school district can agree that even though we're going to talk about math, the math teacher isn't going to be there. Can we agree on that? And if that's okay, then the math teacher has to provide the IEP team with a written input for the team to consider. So now we have an IEP meeting with the special ed teacher of the child and the writing teacher of the child and maybe the reading teacher of the child. We don't have the math teacher, but we're talking about math, right? So we would want that math teacher to provide us input in writing as to how we would modify that math goal. We can do that as long as the parent agrees. And for both of these, we want to make sure that we have an agreement has to be in writing and includes that parent consent to move forward with the IEP without that member. So it has to be in writing. And so what you don't want to do is you don't want to schedule this IEP meeting to talk about math. And you already know that the math teacher's not going to be there, but you haven't said anything to the parent until they walk in the door for the meeting and say, oh, by the way, math teacher's not going to be here, but look, he gave us his input. Can we start the meeting? parent can say, no, we're not going to move forward with the meeting. Let's reschedule it. I want to hear directly from the math teacher. So be prepared for that. We should be giving the parents notice as soon as we know that the teacher's not going to be able to participate. Now we know that there's always going to be those situations, right? That they were in a car accident or they were sick that day and they didn't, if they didn't show up to work, you want to call the parent earlier enough to say, hey, general ed teacher of the child isn't going to be able to be at the meeting. Are you still okay? Will you give agreement to hold this meeting today, or shall we reschedule? So always making sure that we're informing the parent.
Lorie, we have another question.
Sure.
Do services follow students post high school?
Great question. IDEA, IEP services do not follow post high school. They are 3 to 21 provision under IDEA. 21, so long as you have not, so from 18 to 21, right? You go actually, you're allowed to have FAPE until your 22nd birthday. So your full year of 21, you can still be in the K-12 system under IDEA. So when you think about those students that are 18 to 21 or 22 when they turn 22, right? Those kiddos are still working on their transition goals, or probably still, they could be still working on their graduation requirements. They are allowed to be receive that free appropriate public education until that date. Now, once they receive their general education diploma, their regular high school diploma, then they no longer are available for FAPE. So those students that turn 17 or 18 and they receive their regular high school diploma, then their FAPE ends, their free appropriate public school ends, education ends. And then they would go on to community college, university work, and their IEP does not follow them.
And there's a comment in the chat as well. It says they can stay the rest of the year if they turn 22 in the middle of the year. In
No.
New Mexico, the modified and ability options to the diploma do not count as a quote regular diploma.
Correct. So the last half of that comment is true. The modified and the ability do not count as a regular high school diploma. They just gave us a lot of guidance on that just recently. However, the first part of that statement was inaccurately stated. When you turn 22, oh, I shouldn't say that. Maybe you were right. If you turn 22 in the middle of the school year, or at the beginning of the school year before school starts. So let's say my birthday is in October and I'm 21 and I'm going to start school until October and now I turn 22. Yes, you are able in New Mexico, you are able to finish that school year. But typically kiddos that turn 22 like in the spring or in the summer, then they don't start the next school year. Okay, those were just some OSERS. Now, OSERS is the Office of Special Education Rehabilitative Services. So the hierarchy here is the U.S. Department of Ed. We've got OSERS, Office of Special Education Rehabilitative Services, and then we have OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, and then you have your state departments of education. So that's kind of the hierarchy when we're talking about supervision for implementation of IDEA. So OSERS kind of monitors and works alongside OSEP as well. So OSERS actually gave us some indication here about we can't, it may not be reasonable for a public agency to agree or consent to the excusal of the agency rep. For example, the public agency cannot consent to excusal of a public agency rep, that's that LEA rep that we talked about, from an IEP team meeting if that individual is needed to ensure that decisions can be made at the meeting about the commitment of resources that are necessary to implement the IEP. So you have to be really, really careful about who you excuse from that meeting. And yes, you can excuse that LEA rep so long as we're not committing agency resources in order to implement that IEP, which is almost kind of never really. Even us committing our own resources as teachers in an annual IEP meeting, you still need that agency rep. So it's going to be a little harder to excuse that agency rep. And then, of course, we know parents are an extremely important member of the IEP team. And as a matter of fact, when IDEA lists the required IEP members, IDEA lists the parents first. So they are truly important part of the team. And we know we have to take reasonable steps to ensure that one or both of the parents are present at the meeting. And we need to notify them of the meeting early enough, like we talked about earlier, early enough to ensure that they have an opportunity to participate, as well as scheduling that meeting at a mutually agreeable place and time. Can't just send that notice home and say, hey, we're gonna meet at the IEP meeting on November 21st at 3:30, be there or be square. Can't do that, right? We have to seek this mutually agreeable place and time. And of course, we need to be responsive to the parent scheduling needs. However, IDEA does not require that we schedule an IEP meeting in the evenings. We can limit our scheduled meetings of that IEP team during regular school hours or even regular business hours, because there are times that are most suitable to our staff, right? We have an OSEP letter that tells us that. But I do want to caution you. I know time is precious, and I know in our state we have union pressure, right? But we cannot just say the only time we have available for an IEP meeting is from 1 to 1:30 on Thursdays. That's not going to fly under IDEA. Because it's not individualized. Two, we don't even know if parents can get off work to come. We don't want them to have to get off work to come, right? And I know we have set times for our school day, and I got to be gone at 3:30. I can't stay any later. Well, if a parent can be there at 4 because they get off work at 3:30 and be there at 4, we need to make sure that we're considering that option, and hold that IEP meeting either virtually or hold that meeting in person at 4 o'clock, even though my end of my day comes at 3. That's just part of our responsibility under IDEA. We cannot have these little short windows. And truly, to limit an IEP, an annual IEP for an hour, sometimes is not enough time. So you may need to consider, if we're just doing a quick amendment, 30-minute meeting is fine. But when we're looking at an annual IEP meeting, I think you're hard pressed to cover everything in detail in an hour. And so we may need to reconsider or consider, depending on the meeting and depending on the individual circumstances of each child, that we might need to have a 2-hour meeting. Now, I'm never suggesting we have a 6-hour meeting. I've been in those, I've seen those happen, and I'm saying don't do it. If you can't reasonably get to a good stopping point in 2 hours, it's time to break, put a pause on it, and we'll come back at another time and meet for another 2 hours. But to make everyone sit there for 4 to 6 hours to try to do this IEP meeting, you're not getting good quality input. People are tired, they're kind of glazed over, they're like, I'm done, this isn't going to happen. And so be thoughtful about that when we put our IEP meetings on a schedule, making sure that we have enough time to answer parents' questions and answer teachers' questions and develop a really strong IEP. But I wouldn't say let's, 2.5 hours at the most would be where I would ever go. Let's take a look and set that time. Here's our agenda today. We have 2 hours to get through this. What we don't get through, we're going to put on the parking lot, and we're going to come back and revisit that at a later date. So you can certainly do that. We must afford the parents the right to participate in the decisions with respect to identification, evaluation, educational placement, and that provision of faith. And with those placement decisions, IDEA provides this really clear direction that we must make sure that parents are part of that team to make those educational decisions. It's something that we just cannot do in a vacuum. That parent needs to be part of the IEP team. So, do we have a full-blown IEP meeting every time we want to change the IEP? Looking at the time. IDEA tells us procedurally that we can amend the IEP, but only after the annual. And that amendment is not going to change the annual due date, but we have to have the annual IEP meeting. And then from there, if we need to amend the IEP, we can do that throughout the year. And we don't have to have a full-blown IEP meeting each time, okay? The agreement to have an amendment, it does not have to be in writing. We can amend the IEP without a meeting. So, so we've got two different ways. We can amend the meeting or amend the IEP with a meeting, bring the team together, amend the meeting, do a 30-minute, 40-minute meeting. We're done. We've amended the IEP. We've changed the IEP. But you also can, under IDEA, amend the meeting or amend the IEP without a meeting, meaning that we can talk to all of the team members, make sure general ed teacher of the child, special ed teacher of the child, the LEA rep, the person that can interpret evaluation data, and the parent. So we can talk to each one of those individually, and then we can agree to amend the IEP. Now, under IDEA, we don't have to have the agreement to do that in writing or get consent. But what we do need to have is we need to document that the parent was contacted and that they were in agreement to amend the IEP without a meeting. And then we have to develop a document that amends the IEP. And then we want to make sure that that amended document is sent home to the parent, and they understand through our prior written notice, they understand that they have the right to disagree with what we're amending or proposing to amend. And then that amendment also needs to go to all of the teachers so that they can be sure that they're going to implement the IEP as appropriate, including those amendments.
What if the parents want the 6-hour IEP meeting?
They don't get it. We set the tone. It's the district's meeting, and we say, here we have 2 hours. This is the agenda that we're going to talk about. And if we don't get it done in that hour, in those 2 hours, then we're going to break and look at our calendars before we break and say, when can we come back together? So they can't demand that we have a 6-hour IEP meeting. I'm not leaving until we finish all of this. No, that's not how it works here. And your LEA rep is the one that's going to be addressing that. They're going to be saying, you know what, we have an agenda and we're going to start the meeting that way. I know we've got lots to cover today, but we have 2 hours. So I want us all to buckle down. Let's work really hard in 2 hours, get as much as we can get done. And then if we need to come back and revisit pieces that we didn't finish, then we can do that.
And another one, if a student refuses service and parent agrees with their child and there's documentation that services have been refused for a period of time, can that service be exited?
It really kind of depends on the service, and it depends on the IEP team, what you believe. So what our data shows us. So if we know that, well, first off, let me just start. Generally, parents can revoke consent for services anytime they want. Okay. So they can revoke consent. And if they come in and say, I don't want my child to be in special education anymore, here's my written consent. We provide them a written notice with all the things that they're giving up. And we don't provide service anymore. They've revoked it. If the parents are coming in and picking and choosing what services they want. So Lorie has speech and OT and transportation and reading services. I don't want Lorie to have speech anymore. the parent is saying, child doesn't want to go to speech anymore. I don't want him to go to speech anymore. We don't want that service anymore, but we want everything else, right? Again, IDEA does not, and the guidance that we've had from OSEP in guidance letters and all of those pieces say that parents can't pick and choose what services they get. They get the package because we offer the whole package, right? And so what the team would be charged with in that scenario, I don't want the speech, but I want everything else. Then what the team will be charged with is looking at all of our data and making a determination. Can Lorie still receive FAPE, free appropriate public education, and make progress in the general curriculum as well as on their IEP goals without that service? If our data shows that yes, Lorie can make progress appropriate in light of her circumstances with all the other services that we're providing and not providing speech, then the IEP team can withdraw the speech services, right? They can discontinue those speech services. However, if the team looks at the data and says, wow, Lorie really needs those speech services in order to benefit from education, in order to receive the free appropriate education, in order to make progress in general ed, then the team would say, no, we're not going to dismiss speech, and parents, here are your procedural safeguards. And so then the parent would have that opportunity to say, okay, fine, we'll just keep going. Or they can say, I'm going to take you to due process because I don't want that. Or they could say, I'm going to revoke consent for all of it. So if we have a child that is saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, then I do think it's incumbent upon the IEP team to come together and say, student, why don't you want to go? What is it about speech that you don't want to go to speech? Well, I don't like being pulled out of my PE class. Oh, so if we pull you out of the end of English class, will that be okay? Well, yeah, I'd do that then. Okay, then that's what we do. Then we change. So we have to ask the student why they don't want it. Many times as students get older, they don't want to be pulled from class. They don't want to have to go see the special ed teacher or the speech teacher or the OT, right? They don't do that. That's not what their friends are doing. Why have to do that? So it's always best to inquire with the student, why are you refusing? What is it? Do you not like the activities that we're doing? Do you not like being pulled out? Do you know, explore it before we just automatically say, oh, well, then if you don't want to come, then we're not going to make you. Because remember, our job is to offer and provide the service. And if the student doesn't want to partake in those provisions, then we really do need to question why and see if there's a workaround. Great questions. Love these questions today. Thanks. I also want you to check with your district procedure and practices to see if your district has decided when or if we can or can't do an amendment, right? So it's up to the school district to decide if, one, they want to allow you to do an amendment. We don't have to have you do an amendment with or without an IEP meeting, right? They might say, I want you to always have an IEP team with butts in the seat. Everybody's going to be there, right? They have that right to say that. So look at your procedures and your policies and practices in your district to see when and if we can or can't do an amendment. There are certain things that you would never want to do under an amendment. And one of those things, huge things, is change of placement. We would never want to decide that Lorie is leaving the general education classroom and is going to receive all of their services in more special education services in a special education setting, like a resource setting. We would never want to amend the IEP to make that decision. That's a placement decision. We really do need to have a full discussion at the table with the parents, all of that. But some of these are kind of minor, right? So adding an accommodation, that's not a big deal. You know, we want to add a voice to text software on the student's computer. Hey, mom, how do you feel about that? We're seeing that they're having a hard time with writing. We'd like them to be able to do that voice to text and learn how to do that. Is that okay? Those are easy. Determining ESY eligibility is another one that we can do. We've looked at the data. Lori's not eligible. So can we have a meeting without a meeting? Can we amend the IEP without a meeting to say Lori's not eligible for ESY services? Or Lorie is eligible for ESY services, depending on what our data says. Adding or deleting testing accommodations. We've had many of those IEP meetings or IEP amendment meetings IEP amendments without a meeting when we're talking about deleting or adding any testing accommodations. So look at what your district says and their procedures on what we can and can't do. I want to stop a minute and talk a little bit about the team and when we need to make decisions outside of the IEP meeting. When we do that, that's considered predetermination. And we don't ever want to do that. We don't ever want to make a decision outside of an IEP meeting. And again, that can be making a decision to change an IEP without a meeting, but we're still communicating. We're still talking about it. The team is still discussing that decision. So when we look at predetermination, that gets us into so much trouble. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and to clarify just a little, right? That IDEA does allow an IEP team to conduct this informal or unscheduled conversation on issues like teaching methodology, lesson plans, coordinating services, those kinds of things. It doesn't require that the parent be included in those preparatory discussions or activities. School personnel can engage in a meeting. I always call it an educational team meeting. We can do that and we don't have to inform parents. We don't have to have their permission. We have that availability to sit down and have an educational team meeting to discuss, okay, we've got this really tough case and we want to discuss some of our options, some of our proposals. Very, very appropriate under IDEA. But what we can't do is we can't make a decision in those educational team meetings. We can list all of the options that we have, and we may individually have kind of an idea where we'd like to go. We're not going to say that, and we're not going to say that as a group. We're just going to say, what are our options? Here are our options, and we write them down. We bring those options to the IEP table with the parent involved, and we talk about each one of those options. And then we make a proposal, right? So we don't want to pre-decide or predetermine any of the proposals that we're going to make, right? We don't want to decide anything outside that IEP meeting. Now, when we draft an IEP, we can definitely draft an IEP before the meeting and we prepare it. And then we want to send it home to the parent so they can look at what we're thinking. What I would do is I'd caution you on that draft. One, making sure that that draft has draft all over it so they know it's draft. We tell the parent, hi, we're sending you this draft. Anything in this IEP can be revised at the IEP meeting. And then do not put the services, the amount of services that we're going to propose. Do not put LRE statement in there where Lori's going to get her services. If it's an eligibility determination meeting, do not put that Lorie is eligible under IDEA for autism or ED or whatever it happens to be, right? We're not going to give that information in the document that we've drafted. And the reason we don't want to do that is we do not want it to look like we've predetermined that decision. Because school districts right and left have been found out of compliance because they have predetermined, okay? And I have some cases here on predetermination, kind of looking at the time. Hopefully I'll be able to get through a couple of these anyway. This is a recent case that the district unilaterally decided that the child needed an out of district placement. And when the LEA rep, they came into this meeting and they read this prepared statement that reviewed all of the students' previous behavioral issues. And then they stated, due to these concerns, the district feels that the brick and mortar building is not a safe educational placement option, and therefore we're no longer going to be able to provide FAPE in our brick and mortar school due to the behavior and emotional needs. Well, that statement actually decided the case for the state complaint investigator, or actually it was a hearing officer, excuse me. And as a team, they had made this decision before the meeting to propose this out of district placement without discussing any other options by the team. And so again, you need to review all the data that you have. It's great. Glad he reviewed all the data with everybody. Now let's talk. Where's the most appropriate location for services for this student? We need to have that discussion about the full continuum of services and options for the student, not just say, can't be on our campus, got to go out of district placement. Okay. I said word matters earlier, and I really do mean that. Our words that we speak in the meeting and that are in the law really do matter. And here, this special education director told the parent, there's no way that the child can be in regular education. Hearing officer said it was a denial of faith based on not providing meaningful parent participation in the placement decision. Just a matter of that statement. No way, student's not going to be in regular education. They can't be there. They're not going to be successful. So we have to really choose our words carefully when we're talking to parents and when we're considering that predetermination piece. I'm going to let you read this case again, because I've got 45 minutes, got about 60 more slides. Anyway, I did want to bring this. This is a state complaint that came out of Albuquerque Public Schools, so it's a little close to home. And they found that the teacher's email actually predetermined a placement change for the upcoming school year, because it stated the information from the upcoming meeting will assist the student's future school in providing services. So just that statement alone, then they said that it was predetermination. But the complaint investigator did find that there was no denial of FAPE in this matter because the IEP documentation was clear that at the meeting, the team discussed and reviewed all the data and all the placement options with the parent and provided the parent with an opportunity to give input. So they did it right on the meeting end. Just the pre-meeting, it did look like it was predetermination. We were going to talk about future school and not their current school. But because at the meeting, they reviewed all the data, they made the decision as a team, they didn't find that there was a denial of FAPE. This is out of the federal comments, out of the Federal Register, and it actually provides a suggestion that the IEP team, like I said earlier, can draft the IEP prior to the meeting, but make sure that it's abundantly clear to the parent that it is a draft and that all final decisions are going to be made at the IEP meeting and the table. So as an administrator, not only procedural, but we have to also look at the substantive part of the IEP and understand that process. And so you've got to understand the IEP process. It begins with that evaluation. It moves into the present levels, the students' present levels of academic achievement, functional performance. It moves then into the goals and objectives, the measurable goals and objectives. And from there, we make the decision for supplementary aids and services. What kind of services does the child need? And then we talk about placement. So it's this building block of information for the IEP. Here are all the legal requirements that we have. I know some of you may know these. Some of you may not. So here are the legal requirements. And of course, in New Mexico, when we talk about transition planning, we already said that it needs to be the IEP that's going to be in place when the child turns 14. So you want to make sure that you're going to focus on these pieces. today what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit on present levels of academic achievement, functional performance, and then we're going to talk a little bit about goals as well. So I love this case. This case really does sum it up the best, and I want to share it with you. This case said that whatever goes to the heart of the IEP, the present levels is the heart of the IEP. The child's level of academic achievement and functional performance is the foundation on which the IEP is built. Without a clear identification of Robert, who is the student, his present levels, the IEP team cannot set measurable goals, evaluate child's progress, and determine which educational and related services are needed. So they really have said that there should be this connection between present levels and other components of the IEP. So if the statement describes a problem with the child in reading, let's say they have a deficit in reading level, and it points to these skill deficits in our present levels, then that deficit should be addressed under our measurable goals, as well as our specific services that we're going to provide the student, that specially designed instruction. Present level must address both academic and functional performance and how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. And yes, I said both. They have to do both, right? Academic and functional. That's why they call it present levels of academic achievement, functional performance. Case law tells us that the present levels must contain sufficient detail to allow the team to determine the extent of the child's abilities and their barriers to learning. Okay, here's another case that I really love. I love it mostly because of the real artful way that the court described what's going to happen if teachers and parents don't know where the child's progress is going. So here we had a 12-year-old student with autism, significant behaviors. The school district did not have a behavior intervention plan, a FBA. They did not have behavior goals. And their rationale for this was that the behaviors were like a manifestation of the autism. It was very characteristic of a student with autism to have these behaviors, and therefore we didn't need to address it in the IEP. I hope some of you are going, oh, what? Anyway, so keep in mind that while they were at the hearing, the student was pulling the attorney's hair. They were kissing the expert's witness on the cheek. They rubbing the hearing officer's head. And here's what the court said, and I love the way they wrote it. Without meaningful, measurable objectives and goals, Benton, the student, his educators and parents were engaged in this futile endeavor to pin the tail on that moving donkey while blindfolded in the dark. The mushy, ambiguous, unquantifiable goals often listed in the student's IEP are at odds with the IDEA. Their vague and unmeasurable objectives are handmaidens of stagnation, as the program cannot possibly confer an education benefit to the student if his teachers and his parents do not know where they are trying to take the student and how they know when they're going to get there. So bottom line, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you're getting there? But I just love this little part. I just think it was so artful the way actually the district court phrased this. So I love that case. Anyway, so what makes a good legally defensible goal? In this case, this is where the district did everything right. Middle school student with ADHD, district IEP addressed the academic, the social, emotional, behavioral needs. District offered co-teaching, classroom accommodations, and counseling service. And here the hearing officer, as well as the district court, said parent could not recover the private school tuition that they were seeking. They said that where certain goals are overly broad, because the parent was saying, well, these goals are too broad. You can't even tell that the child's making progress. And the court said, where there are certain goals that are overly broad, courts have found an IEP to be satisfactory when there are short-term objectives, concretely outlining targeted subskills, identify criteria for mastery, and set forth procedures to be used for measuring progress, and specify a date by which that progress is going to be made. So they were saying, hey, if you've got these broad goals, write some objectives that will clearly inform the team on how to ensure that the child makes progress on those goals and objectives. And remember, goals and objectives and benchmarks are only required under IDEA for those students who are taking the alternate assessment under alternate state standards, alternate standards. And so here they're saying it doesn't hurt anyone to have objectives or benchmarks in their IEP, especially if we have overbroad goals. Supplementary aids and services, again, these are just the services and supplementary aids and supports that we're going to provide the student in order to be enabled for them to enable them to participate with their non-disabled peers, as well as extracurricular and non-academic settings. Here are some examples of some supplementary aids and services. Any modifications to the regular ed curriculum, use of computer-assisted devices, use of a resource room, special education training. This comes out of an OSEP memo. They kind of gave us some ideas. This was in '94, so it was quite a while ago, but it's still relevant. And then here are some more common examples, accommodations and modifications, changing to the material or procedures that allow the student to participate in learning and assessment, shortened assignment breaks, extended preferential seating, maybe a peer buddy, this direct service support, assistive technology, specialized equipment. You can see those there. Also adaptive materials, books on tape, large print, environmental changes, and also instructional changes. Another part of the substantive discussion that we have under IDEA is that it requires the teams to consider educating those students in that, educating the students with disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate to with students without disabilities. And we can only be removed, like we said earlier, unless those supplementary aids and services are not effective enough to support the student in the general classroom. We have to have this full continuum of services available, these full continuum services options available. It doesn't mean that we have to try every single placement on the continuum, but we do need to have them available just in case we need them. And that includes regular class, special schools, home instruction, instruction in hospitals and institutions. And yes, our charter schools still also require this full continuum of options available. What about placement? How do we make that decision? Remember that the placement is not a location. It's the amount of services. Special education is a service. It's not a place, right? It's the services that we provide along the continuum, not a location, not a place like a classroom or something. It's those services. Here in the 10th Circuit, this is just a reminder. I'm not going to cover much of this, but here in the 10th Circuit, we have 5 factors that we have to consider when we are considering the least restrictive environment, that continuum of services. So I want you to be sure you take a look at these. We have to make sure that we're taking steps to accommodate the child in the regular classroom. Are these steps that we're taking, are they sufficient steps, or are they just token? Are we just writing it on paper saying, yeah, we tried it? Whether the child receives education benefit from the regular classroom, whether the child's overall educational experience in the mainstream environment, and then what effect does the child's presence have on that classroom environment. So the 10th Circuit and we are in the 10th Circuit, so these are things that our IEP teams need to consider when we're considering LRE. So again, as an administrator, you're going to want to know those. So when we go into those IEP meetings and we're talking about a change of placement for the child, that we make sure that we're addressing those questions. And then all placement decisions that we make are always documented clearly in the prior written notice. That we want to make sure that we're explaining to the extent appropriate when the child is not going to be participating in the general curriculum or in extracurricular or non-academic settings. Remember, part of Andrew, and I didn't cover it earlier, but part of the Andrew F case, that Supreme Court case in 2017, they really said that the school district must be able to give cogent and responsive explanations as to why we are doing what we're doing. And so that would include our placement decisions. That would include our goals. That would include the services that we're providing. We want to make sure we have strong data that supports our reasons for why we're proposing what we're proposing. Those are our substantive. Now, understanding kind of your role in an IEP meeting. Now, IDEA does not require principals and administrators to participate in or on any kind of IEP meeting, but it does require that we have an LEA rep at every meeting who has that authority to commit resources. And so for this reason, many times our principals often participate in those meetings. So here are a few things that you want to know in understanding your role as at an IEP meeting. Your role as a site leader is to really set those expectations for your staff, meaning that there should be expectations that all IEP team members are there and that every meeting has the required members. We need that parent, regular ed teacher of the child, special ed teacher of the child, at least one of each one of those, the LEA rep, person who can interpret the data, child if appropriate, and any other members at your discretion that we believe have knowledge of the child. You cannot act as the general education teacher if you're not the general education teacher of the child. I have that many times that the principal will go to the meeting. Oh, I'm a general ed teacher. I'm going to sign as the LEA rep and the gen ed teacher of the child. But just because you have that licensure, and I think we've talked about that, you cannot sign unless you are the teacher of the child. And then, of course, after the meeting, you've really got to hold the teachers accountable for implementing the IEP as it's written, right? And during that meeting, you're going to want to make sure that you're kind of keeping everybody on track with that meeting. So before the meeting, you want to be prepared for that IEP meeting. So you should really review all that information from the student's evaluation and most recent IEP. When you review that, then that gives you a general idea of the student's strengths and their weaknesses and their performance in the classroom. You also want to, before the meeting, you want to ensure that all the required members are going to be there. And if required, members have to be absent. Be sure that you use that excusal process. And remember that excusal process does require that agreement from the parent prior to the meeting for that person to be excused. And if we're going to talk about that person's, participant's area of expertise or need in the meeting, then we have to provide that in writing, their input in writing to the meeting. And then also ensure that the parents are invited to the meeting in a timely manner and allow them to participate. So that's your role kind of before the meeting.
Lorie, there's a really long one in the chat. I'm not sure if you want to address it now or if you want to address it at the end if we have time.
Okay, can I open it or do you want to read it to me?
You could open it. It may be better if you read it because it's really long.
Okay, let me see. Oh, I found it. All right. For the effect the child's present has on the regular education environment. Okay, so we're talking about the LRE, the 10th Circuit standards. Can this factor be one that determines this student's placement, even though the effect might be one that is more from the other student's perspective? For instance, if a child has poor impulse control and consistently touches others or takes their things, thereby distracting others and themselves during the learning process, would it be appropriate to lessen their time in the regular education setting with maximum class sizes? I'm not quite sure what the maximum class size says, but let's talk about that. Remember our LRE, and I'm going to go back because we're going to look at that. We have to look at all of them. We can't just look at one. I'm going to go back. There it is. We have to look at all of these factors. One factor does not outweigh the others. So have we taken steps to accommodate that student, with a disability in the regular classroom, and were they sufficient? So when you're looking at this and the student with a disability is disrupting or touching or being inappropriate, have we taken steps to extinguish that behavior? Do we have an FBA? Do we have a BIP? Do we have strategies in place to teach the student appropriate boundaries, right? So that's going to be the first couple questions that we're going to ask, right? And were those steps that we took, were they sufficient, or did we just, oh yeah, we have a BIP, we didn't implement it with fidelity, but we have one? Then that's a token effort. That's not a sufficient effort, right? And so whether the child is receiving an educational benefit from that environment, that's something that we want to look at. So, so we'll take a look at, did we take those steps? Is he making any kind of progress? Is he gaining any benefit from that regular environment? What is their overall experience in the mainstream? Do we have any time of his life and his day that he is successful, that he's not inappropriately touching? Has he made gains on those behavior intervention plans that we put in place? And then the effect of the child's present that it has on the whole environment. And yes, that is disruptive, but have we taken steps in 1 through 4 to help alleviate that? If those steps that we've taken and they were sufficient and it's still not making gains, and we're not improving and not changing the behavior, then yeah, the team can say, hey, we've tried it, it was sufficient, it's not working. Yes, he is receiving maybe a little bit of benefit in this section or this time of day or that classroom, but his overall experience in the mainstream has been a struggle and has been difficult. And certainly his impact on the other children in the classroom has taken its toll. In looking at that, the team really looking at all that data, the team really wants to consider a more restrictive environment. So that's how you would play that. It would never just be one. Okay. Great question. Wow. Great question. So now let me bounce back. Understanding your role, administrator, before the meeting. You want to make sure that you're establishing an agenda. And there again, that'll be always bringing that team back to the task at hand, and also setting that time limit for that agenda. Establish the meeting norms in that meeting, especially if you have a cranky parent or a cranky advocate or someone that maybe even a cranky teacher, right? We want to set those norms for that meeting. I always say setting the norms for every meeting, right? So in every room that we hold an IEP meeting or parent meeting or a teacher meeting, have those norms posted on the wall. That way, we will not ever get a claim of retaliation, meaning that you only have norms for my meeting because I'm holding you accountable for my child's education, right? Oh, you can say, no, every room, every meeting we have these norms. So making sure that we set this standard in our schools so that we do have norms for meetings, and we use them for every meeting that we have, not just pinpointing those maybe difficult meetings that we might have, right? And always listen to parents' issues and concerns and inputs. During the meeting, you're going to encourage that a collaboration between the school team members and the parents. You're going to set aside enough time to go through thoroughly discuss the plan and develop that plan. And then you want to make sure that everyone's focused at hand. So developing that individualized plan based on the evaluation data and the unique needs of the student. And that's our focus, right? How much time is the student going to spend in general education classroom? You're going to want to have that discussion, the duration of services, who's going to provide those. You want that rich discussion in that IEP meeting, and you may have to guide that discussion depending on, actually, I always say, depending on the strength of your IEP team. We have lots of student teachers. We have lots of alternative licensed teachers in our classrooms right now who maybe don't have the experience they need in running an IEP meeting. So you as the leader may be the best person to help us lead those meetings because you have a little bit more experience with that. And during the meeting, always want you to listen to the parents, ask those questions, continually check for understanding. Are you sure, Mom, you understand what we're talking about here? And identify any reevaluation that might need to be done. Again, here are some good questions that you could ask during the meeting. Present levels of performance. Sorry. Present levels of performance. What are the academic areas in which the student needs assistance? What are the social emotional issues? On and on and on. We've got lots of different questions that we can ask. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk about, well, what are some of the things that we don't want to say? Because remember, I said words matter, and they do. We never want to say this laundry list of statements. We've never done that before. We don't do that for any other child. We're a full inclusion district. We can't afford it. We only provide that for students with autism. We don't have equipment, don't have the authority to make that decision. I don't care what the IEP says. We're not doing that. I don't think transportation is going to approve that. We don't have the staff for it. We've spent way too much time reviewing this option. These are the things that you do not want to say. What you do want to say is, if the parent is asking for something, our answer really does need to include that the IEP team is going to consider the evaluation data to see if the student needs that requested service in order to receive FAPE. So our statement really should look something like this. The parent is asking for something, and the teacher says, I can't afford that. District rep should really say, well, it may be an expensive item, but we're not going to rule it out on that basis. What we are going to do is we're going to review your child's evaluation data to determine if your child needs that device in order to receive FAPE, free appropriate public education. And if we need more evaluation data to make that determination, we'll conduct further evaluation. If the IEP team determines, based on evaluation, that your child needs this device, then we'll figure out a way to make it happen. I want you to memorize that statement. I want all of our teachers to memorize that statement. I want all of our administrators to memorize that statement. I think that is so important. We are always going to base our decisions on services and needs of the child based on evaluation data. If the evaluation data comes back that the child needs that in order to receive FAPE, then we have this obligation to provide it. And then following the IEP meeting, I want you to make sure that your staff is prepared to do this. As we wrap up the IEP, you have to make sure that your staff understand making data-based recommendations. We should not be putting anything in the IEP that does not have data to support it. Give those cogent and responsive explanations. Tell us why we're doing what we're doing. Share student progress with the parents. Appropriately address any parent concerns. And after the meeting, please implement the IEP. We can have this beautiful IEP, and it's all in its beautiful form. But if we don't implement it, now we have a substantive violation because we're not providing the services that are allowing the student to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. So making sure that you implement that IEP. And as a school leader, that's going to be your job to ensure that the teachers are implementing the IEP as appropriate. At the end of the meeting, you can verify with the team agreement or not agreement. And I'm really kind of saying more with the parent. Are you in agreement with what we're doing? Are you not in agreement? There's no signature except for in the initial placement and the initial eligibility. But just to say, how do you feel about this, Mom? I'm not in agreement. I really don't like it. Okay. So then we want to make sure that they're informed of their parental rights, even inform them of the parental rights, even if they are in agreement. But don't give in to a request that is educationally inappropriate. And what I mean by that is parents sometimes will come into the IEP meeting with this laundry list of accommodations. Here's 2 pages of accommodations, and here's what I want to do. I heard something today that just floored me. I was with a client, And they said that this child was moving from the elementary to the middle school. And in the elementary school, their IEP indicated an accommodation. And that accommodation was, which I thought was very interesting, their accommodation was that anytime the child was faced with an assessment, math test, spelling test, reading test, school test, statewide test, the parent would come and administer that assessment. Because this parent was so demanding that the team just acquiesced and said, okay, whatever you want to do. You want to come in, we'll set up a room for you to administer the test to your child. I'm going to say that's not educationally appropriate. Our job is to provide those assessments. Our job is to educate the student, not the parents. So don't just acquiesce to anything that the parent wants. Make sure that we are providing services and accommodations and educational plans that are appropriate for the student, because it's all good until it's not. And it's going to come back to get us if we don't really take a judicious look at what the parent is requesting of us. It's okay for us to say no. We don't need 32 accommodations, right? We can, if we have 32 accommodations in an IEP, we're never teaching. We're only just accommodating and taking data. So be judicious. What's the disability? How does it impact the child and the general curriculum? What kind of supports that are reasonable that we put in place for the student? And it's not reasonable for the parent to come and administer all of our assessments. So anyway, I had to share that because that just happened today. I couldn't believe it. So don't acquiesce to everything the parent wants, right? We have this obligation to provide that appropriate education. And then, of course, your role after the meeting, give the parent and the teachers all the copies and modifications of the IEP and the plan, the behavior intervention plan. In New Mexico, we have the requirement that we have to give that prior written notice at the end of the meeting. Make sure that your teachers are providing that to the parents before they leave. Ensure that the IEP modifications are implemented. And I've already, document that you've given those IEP accommodations, modifications, and those service plans and the goals to the teachers. Make sure you're documenting that those teachers received it. Also, accessibility to the IEP. IDEA says that every teacher that is responsible for implementing the IEP, we must give them a copy of it, or at least have access to it if it's electronic. And they have to be informed of their duty and what they have to do to implement that IEP. We can't just say, here's the IEP, go forth and prosper. We want to make sure that we're informing them of what their job is and how they're going to implement that IEP. Substitute teachers also, we want to make sure that our substitute teachers are aware of the students in their class that they substitute with, that that they have an IEP, and that they receive accommodations, modifications in that classroom. So please don't, I get this, oh, well, that's against FERPA. It's not against FERPA, because FERPA actually says that we have this obligation to inform people who have this educational need to know of their responsibilities regarding implementation of the IEP, and substitute teachers do have that need to know. So make sure that maybe for your substitutes, you have this check sheet or this folder for them, or a list of contact information for people in the district or the school who they can ask questions of, provide any kind of seating charts or any kind of accommodations that we might need. And also, don't forget to share those data collection forms. We don't want our data collection to stop just because we have a substitute in the classroom. I think we've already kind of talked about that. Make sure that we have documentation that we've informed the teacher of their responsibility to implement the IEP. We can't pick and choose, making sure that we tell our teachers, you can't pick and choose what accommodations that you're going to implement. You have to implement the IEP as it's written. And if something is not working or it's not effective, then you need to pull that IEP team together and amend the IEP. The teacher cannot unilaterally make a change. even if the parent agrees to it. Well, I spoke to the parent on the phone. She said she'd agreed for me not to have to do that accommodation. No, it's an IEP team decision. It's not a teacher and a parent. That's another case. The takeaway out of this case is that teachers and school administrators may not unilaterally decide how and when to, or how frequent to provide a student with accommodations. So we're there. We have to make sure that we provide the services that are in the IEP. And even if the teacher disagrees with it, then their option is to implement it until you have an IEP meeting. And then you can say, this isn't working in my class, or it's not effective, or whatever the data shows on why we don't want to use that accommodation.
Lorie, you have another question?
Sure. Go right
How
ahead.
long can a substitute teacher be in special education classroom when there is no teacher?
Wow. I wish I had a really good answer for that. I don't. I can, because that's based in state law, and I don't have that like right off the tip of my tongue. So I can certainly, when I get the chat from the webinar today, I'll take a look at getting you that answer, and then I'll send that to CES so they can distribute that to everyone. But I don't have that answer off the top of my head. I know there is a certain timeline though. So thanks for the question. I did jump ahead a little bit to a word on virtual meetings. Your virtual meetings are the same thing. They're just like in-person meetings. We've always had the ability to do a virtual meeting, not just because COVID came and we all found it. We've always had it. You can see under 300.328 of IDEA regulation, we've always had this opportunity to do video conferencing or conference calls. So it's nothing new, but what it is new is we want to make sure that if our meeting is virtual, that you still provide those same procedures, that we have to give reasonable advance notice. We have to let the parents know where it's going to be, which will be virtual. We need to send them the link. We want to make sure that it's convenient, mutually convenient for them. And what are those issues that we're going to discuss? I've also given you some mechanics here. I'm looking at my time. Mechanics here for running a virtual meeting, making sure that it's professional, making sure people have their cameras on, making sure that they're dressed appropriately, refraining for eating and drinking. Always check to make sure that the parent understands. Do a check 15 minutes before the meeting to make sure the parent can access, or all of our parties can access, the technology. Make sure you're looking in the camera if you can, and then stay focused on the meeting instead of focused around what's going on. Don't be laying on the floor, making sure you're sitting up, all of those kind of things. And remember your nonverbal communication. When you're in a meeting and things are going on, many times when you're in person, it's a little easier to have that professional look on your face. But sometimes when we're on virtual, we kind of doze off, or we're like, oh my God, we're making the faces. We don't want to do that, right? So making sure that you're aware, and you teach your teachers and talk to your teachers about how appropriate, how important it is to be professional on the calls.
You have two more questions, but
Sure.
okay.
I'm gonna let you all look at this. I'm gonna let me scroll through this, and then I'll get those two questions. Understanding how to be a chief advocate. I've given you some information here on things that you can think about as a school leader on how you can be an advocate for students with disabilities. I am gonna let you read that at your own leisure. Like many of you have sat in on my calls before. I give you a wealth of information in the material. I want them to be a resource for you. So please make sure that you're looking at those and using those, since I didn't kind of get to all of those. And although all of these are really great hints to keep you out of legal disputes, remember, you can do everything right, and still the parents are going to file a complaint or due process. So documentation is your best friend. So always make sure that you're documenting your efforts to assist your team, your child, and then of course your legal team, should you be faced with any kind of legal action. With that, thanks so much for all of your great work in the schools. Have a great Thanksgiving. I am going to answer those questions though. So thanks for participating. What are our questions?
Okay, I'm going to tell you the 2 questions, and whatever's left over, I'm going to send to you and we'll post them later.
Fabulous.
Okay, so can a virtual meeting be recorded?
Absolutely. A virtual meeting can be recorded, and of course, I think usually Zoom. I don't know about other platforms because I usually try to use Zoom, but usually you get a little notice. Meeting is being recorded. You certainly can record it. What I would say is, if you record it, be prepared to give it to the parent. Okay, so because 2 people can't record at the same time. So if we're going to record on Zoom anyway, I don't know if other platforms you can do 2 recordings, but if you're going to record it, make sure that the parent gets a copy of it.
Does a special education teacher need to attend a speech-only IEP?
Interesting. In New Mexico, speech can be a standalone special education service. So if it is a speech language student and it's special and that it is the primary disability category, right? And it's a standalone, doesn't have any other disability category eligibility, then your speech pathologist is your special educator. They are the person that is providing the specialized instruction to that student. So no, you would not need another special education person, because there wouldn't be one, right? It would just be your speech pathologist or your speech, your speech pathologist would be your case manager for that. So you would need a general education teacher of the child and the special education teacher or the service provider of that child. And in that particular case, it would be your speech person because it's a standalone eligibility. Great question. Awesome. Thanks so much.